Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a really interesting space today. One that almost feels like a contradiction at first glance. We're talking about finding these, deep lessons about truth, power, citizenship, all in pretty serious, challenging times, and somehow doing it with like a touch of humor and some surprising stories mixed in.
That juxtaposition, yeah, that's absolutely key here. We're looking at how, going back to a specific historical moment, but
Mhm.
through this unique lens, a play about the journalist Edward R. Murrow, how that can give us some pretty striking insights into where we are now politically and socially.
Exactly. And the source material for this whole deep dive, it comes from a conversation with George Clooney. He's
Wow.
involved with this play. And he shared his thoughts in a CNN interview about what this play brings to light about Murrow's time and, crucially, how that connects, like, directly to the challenges we're all seeing right now.
Right. It's not just history for history's sake. It's about drawing these really potent parallels, looking at how those, pillars of democracy are holding up, at least according to this view, and thinking about the role individuals play, even celebrities, right,
Yeah.
in these big important moments.
Mm. And yeah, like you hinted at, he somehow manages to weave in some genuinely funny observations and these unexpected behind the scenes bits too, adds a whole different layer.
It really does. It makes it feel more real, I guess.
Totally. So, our mission for you today is basically to pull out the key nuggets from this conversation. What historical echoes are loudest? How does he assess our institutions now? What does he say about courage, about standing up? And maybe what weird twists happen even when you're working on something serious. Let's see what we can extract.
Okay, let's start with the core, like you said,
Huh.
the play itself, all about Edward R. Murrow. And the source really emphasizes Murrow as this powerful symbol, almost like a standard bearer.
Right. Clooney talks about the privilege of getting to actually say Murrow's words on stage. How Murrow back then really represented us at our best.
Yeah.
He was someone who could just articulate these fundamental truths, cut through the noise in those moments when clear, eloquent truth was just desperately needed.
Yeah. You know that feeling when you think of the perfect thing to say, like hours
Oh,
later?
totally. It happens all the time.
Murrow seemed to have that clarity in the moment and used it when it really, really counted.
And you can feel that power, apparently, in how the audience reacts. The source describes people literally leaning forward, engaged.
And then, by the end,
Hmm.
the whole front row is just weeping.
Weeping. Wow, that's a strong reaction. What does Clooney think is behind that? Why that level of emotion?
He thinks it's because people are just hungry for it. They want a space, a real physical room to hear about and talk about who we are at our best.
Hmm.
It's like reconnecting with a sense of integrity, maybe. A standard they admire, something maybe they feel is missing or under attack now. The
Yeah.
play gives them that moment.
Okay, that makes sense. But what's really fascinating, I think, is how they handle audience interruptions. Like people trying to make their own political points during the show.
Oh, yeah, that's such a great detail. And it touches on that sort of unexpected element we mentioned. He says they've actually had people shout things out like resist or stand up. And apparently from both sides, people wanting to make their point right there in the theater.
So what do they do? Just ignore it.
No, get this. They respond in character as Edward R. Murrow.
Seriously? As Murrow, how does that work?
Yes. As Murrow, the seasoned journalist, he says the response is something like, as a reporter who's covered countless protests, he believes the nation was founded on protest, First Amendment, Constitution, all that. But then still, as Murrow, he'd add something like, he hopes they feel satisfied with their protest, but now maybe they could let the other people who paid actually see the play.
Huh. That's brilliant. It acknowledges the impulse, but gently shuts it down. And the source notes it's kind of hard to argue with that framing, right?
Exactly. Especially when it's framed around speaking truth to power. Because, as Clooney points out, that idea cuts both ways.
Cuts both ways. Explain that a bit.
Well, it's a phrase everyone likes to use now, right?
Mhm.
Both sides feel they are the ones speaking truth to power, challenging the establishment, whatever that means to them.
Okay, right. Everyone's the underdog in their own story.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But the flip side, the part that makes it cut both ways, is that whoever is in power, they don't actually enjoy being challenged. Not really. He even mentions, kind of offhand, his friendships with presidents who, despite what they might say publicly, didn't love being called constantly on the carpet.
Yeah, I can imagine it highlights that basic power dynamic. Which brings us back to Murrow himself, whose story is presented as a kind of cautionary tale.
A cautionary tale, yeah. Because he basically bet everything, his career, his reputation on telling the truth about McCarthy. A really risky move at the time. with all the fear swirling around.
And he won, right? I mean, history proved him right. His journalism stood up.
He won in the sense that truth prevailed, yes, his integrity was vindicated, but it definitely cost him his career at CBS. It wasn't a free win. There were consequences.
Which leads to maybe one of the most important takeaways Clooney mentions.
Absolutely. He says losing your job, that's not the worst thing that can happen in these kinds of situations.
Okay, so what is?
The worst thing, he argues, is letting a moment that really needed someone to stand up and challenge it, just slip by because you were afraid, because of cowardice.
Wow. Okay. That shifts the perspective entirely. It's not about your career. It's about civic duty, moral responsibility.
Something like that. It frames it much bigger than just personal gain or loss. And thinking about those challenging moments, that brings us to his observations about today, about the current landscape.
Right. He seems genuinely taken aback by some of it.
Yeah, he uses the phrase dominoes that have fallen. He expresses real surprise at the speed and the scale of changes he's seen since the previous administration came in.
And he gives some specific examples. Some are pretty pointed, like seeing billionaires at the inauguration.
And then there's that bit about the Netflix deal, the one reportedly involving Melania Trump.
Oh, yeah. How did he put that?
He pauses, right, and says something like, $40 million for documentaries. That's a lot of money for a documentary.
Okay.
And then, with his perfect dry delivery, he adds, I'm anxious to see the documentary, though.
Right. A little bit of subtle shade there, maybe. Using humor to comment without getting into a whole thing lets you draw your own conclusion.
Exactly. He also mentions damage he sees to institutions like USA. Calls it remarkable in a negative way and hard to fix.
But what really seemed to surprise him, based on the source, was how effective certain efforts were, specifically against the universities, against the law firms.
Yes, he sees that as something new, strategically speaking, a kind of willingness to burn it all down, targeting these centers of influence that maybe weren't targeted in the same way before.
So how does he assess the overall health of the pillars of democracy right now?
Well, he looks at the legislative branch, Congress, and is pretty blunt. Not doing a very good job right now.
Okay. Fairly common sentiment, maybe. What about the courts?
The judicial branch, he feels, has done some pretty remarkable things. So a contrast there suggests maybe one pillar is holding up better than another, in his view.
And the press?
He doesn't assess it directly in the same way, but by constantly bringing up Murrow as the standard, the implication is clear. The press is facing its own huge challenges, but that ideal of truth-telling is still the benchmark to aim for.
Got it. And speaking of pointed comments, there was that anecdote about Elon Musk.
Oh, right. Musk apparently called some spending bill a disgusting abomination.
And Clooney's reaction to that was something.
Yeah, he basically says, if you were surprised by things getting worse, or if you didn't see problems like that coming, then you must have been taking some of Elon Musk's pillbox.
Oof. Okay, yeah, that's definitely intended humor, but with a sharp edge. Using Musk's quote to make a wider point about, political awareness, or maybe misplaced optimism.
Seems like it. It's definitely a memorable line, using that specific kind of political humor.
It is, and sticking with prominent figures. He talks quite a bit about Donald Trump, but primarily through the lens of him being a celebrity.
Yes, that identity celebrity first is presented as really fundamental to understanding the whole phenomenon. He even points out the specific detail. Trump has a star on Hollywood Boulevard. Like celebrities do.
Which is the setup for another one of Clooney's deadpan lines, right?
Exactly. He jumps in and says, he doesn't have a star on Hollywood Boulevard. And then quickly adds, I'm not lobbying for one. I just say, it seems like an oversight, by the way, what's going on.
It's funny, but it also kind of subtly reinforces the point about how weird the intersection of celebrity and politics has become. Who gets recognized where and why?
Right. He describes Trump as having a unique set of skills, being his own entity, someone who doesn't really fit the mold of a traditional politician.
And because of that uniqueness, Clooney suggests that Trumpism itself might be hard to replicate once Trump isn't the main figurehead.
Yeah, his view is that others lack that specific, he calls it charisma, needed to deliver the message in the same way. It's tied very personally to Trump himself.
Okay. And did the source touch on the other side, like the Democrats situation?
Briefly. He mentions polling showing Democrats are not doing great. But he frames it less as a permanent decline and more as, a natural outcome after being politically beaten. He points to histories, suggesting parties can bounce back surprisingly quickly. He references the Democrats' recovery after the George W. Bush years, which led to Obama's rise. It's presented as just a normal political cycle, basically. His observation, of course.
It's interesting how consistently he pulls on history for that kind of perspective, not just for parties, but for individuals too, like courage.
Absolutely. He talks about knowing people, friends from an older generation, who are actually on Nixon's enemies list.
Right, the infamous list. How did they feel about that? Ashamed, scared.
No, completely the opposite. They were proud to be on it. He says they'd apparently tell him they would have been so ashamed if they weren't on that list.
Wow. That totally reframes being targeted. It becomes like a badge of honor, meaning you were seen as a threat by an administration they viewed as corrupt or improper.
Precisely. And that connects right back to that powerful idea he mentioned earlier. Being able to look your kids in the eye and say, when things got tough, when there was a moment that mattered, this is where I stood.
Even if you didn't win, even if your actions didn't change the outcome.
That's the key point. Effectiveness isn't the only measure. The crucial thing was that you acted, and you didn't act out of cowardice.
Because acting out of fear, letting that moment slide just because you're scared of what might happen to you.
That's the real failure. According to this view, that's when you've lost, before the fight even really starts.
And he uses Murrow's words again here, doesn't he?
He does. That powerful line, "We are not descended from fearful men." He brings up history again, the U.S. taking on the Nazis when, as he puts it, the country was kind of a paper tiger, militarily at first. But they stood up anyway and ultimately defeated the face of evil. It's a call to remember that capacity for courage, for principled resistance, even when facing overwhelming power.
A really potent reminder. And connecting to future generations, he mentioned giving tickets to the play to a whole bunch of kids.
Yeah, like 2,000 kids got to see the Murrow play, which sounds great, but also
Leads to another humorous observation.
you've got it. He fully acknowledges they have no idea who any of these people are. Eisenhower, McCarthy, Murrow himself. It's all ancient history to them. Totally unfamiliar.
So did they just zone out? What was the point?
Well, he says, despite not knowing the names or the specific context, they got it at the end. Something landed.
And what was the it they got? What was the core message that cut through?
He sums it up as this principle. Challenge, challenge, challenge with more power than you. Defend people with less power than you.
Okay. Challenge up, defend down.
Basically, yeah.
Right.
If you just operate by that rule, use your energy challenging the powerful and protecting the vulnerable, then you've succeeded. Even if you don't win every fight, even if you make mistakes, acting on that principle is success.
That's a really clear, actionable takeaway. Shifting gears just a bit, the source also gives us some behind-the-scenes stuff, right? Personal details, production stories.
Yeah, which adds some nice color, makes it more grounded. He reveals the play is partly a tribute to his own dad.
His father was in news too, wasn't he?
Yeah, an anchorman for 40 years. And Clooney shares this really charming story about how, when he was a kid, his dad used to stand up on a chair and practiced delivering the famous Murrow speech that bookends the play.
No way. So there's this direct personal link for him to Murrow's words. That's lovely.
It really is. And then there's this completely wild anecdote about how the play almost didn't happen. Or rather, how it ended up as a movie first.
Oh yeah, the live TV show plan. What happened there?
Get this. It was all set to be a live TV event, but then it got bumped by the exposed breast.
Wait, you mean the Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident?
The very same.
Mhm.
Apparently, the fallout from that, the crackdown on live broadcasts, killed the live TV project dead.
So because of that,
Yeah.
completely unrelated event, they had to pivot.
Yep. They took the script, cut out the planned commercial breaks, and turned it into the movie Good Night and Good Luck instead.
That's incredible. Talk about unexpected turns. He tells it with that kind of you couldn't make this stuff up vibe, I bet.
Totally. A perfect example of how random life can be, even for big projects. He also shared some cool details about the stage set.
Wick wick.
It's a replica of the old CBS newsroom, which was actually inside Grand Central Station. Desks slide in and out of the floor, lights move around, and the cameras.
What about the cameras?
Well, he finds some humor there, too. He mentions that a lot of the cameras you see on stage, they're fake. Just wood props, no lenses on.
okay.
Part of the illusion.
Okay. Standard theater stuff.
But then he adds, with a wink, we have a real one hidden over somewhere else, actually capturing stuff for the show.
Ah, okay. So a mix of real and fake.
Yeah, and he clarifies that at least one camera on the stage is a real, working broadcast camera, hooked up. It shoots video that gets displayed on monitors as part of the set. So a little technical humor about how you create reality on stage.
That's fascinating. Okay, so let's circle back to Murrow's words themselves. Clooney really emphasizes how relevant they still feel, how they hit home today.
He really does. He highlights two quotes specifically that he says he's always proud to deliver. The first one, "We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason."
Wow. Yeah, you can see why that resonates. So much talk about fear and division now. What was the second one?
We must remember that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law.
Another one that feels incredibly timely. Due process. Seems like that's constantly being debated.
Exactly. He connects it directly to today, saying you hear people talking about maybe not using due process, or even, he says, people joking about getting rid of the writ of habeas corpus.
Which is like the bedrock protection against being locked up without cause.
Right. He stresses these aren't small things. They're the absolute foundation, the underpinning of our government.
And his final thought on those lines is just how well they age. They still land because the principles are fundamental, timeless, and maybe always under threat.
Seems to be the implication. They need constant defending, constant reaffirming.
Yeah.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've pulled out quite a lot, from Murrow's enduring standard to the vital need for truth, due process, courage, to the challenges our institutions face and that call for individual action, especially challenging power and defending the vulnerable.
And all seen through this unique lens, a play, a conversation with Clooney, history meeting the present. And yeah, punctuated by these moments of wit, these surprising anecdotes about everything from Netflix deals to Super Bowl mishaps.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About history repeating, about the effort needed to keep core values alive, but also how unexpected things, even humor, shape the narrative.
Absolutely. And for you listening, how do these lessons, these observations filtered through this source, how do they land with you? How do they maybe inform how you navigate all the information, the noise, the civic stuff today? What stands out about that idea of standing up, even when it's costly? How does Murrow's example or Clooney's take on it resonate?
And thinking about that principle the kids apparently grasped, challenging those with more power, defending those with less. In a world where information is power and where overload can sometimes make us feel paralyzed or, well, fearful.
What does it mean for you to challenge effectively and to defend courageously? Maybe something to mull over as you go about your day.